So I think it's been a year and a half since I've spoken at a conference. Yeah, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of the Larakia people, traditional owners of this land. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, and hope for the best outcomes for the indigenous communities of the future. Let's see. Yeah, my talk, I changed the title slightly. I don't think it's modeling, actually. I should change it again. I should jump into it. It's a lot of slides and I won't finish. Earlier, targets were mentioned, restoration targets. And I worked about 20 plus years in Indonesia, still work in Indonesia, though I'm based here in Darwin the last 5 years. In 2017, there was policy to restore all of Indonesia's degraded and deforested mangroves by 2045, 1.82 million hectares. And there's been this new policy to accelerate action on that and restore or rehabilitate 600,000 hectares of mangroves in the next 4 years. These policies came out from the president as well as coordinating ministries. They're basing their targets on real data of mangrove degradation and deforestation. This comes from the Mangrove 1 map that Indonesia has produced. This is Kalimantan. And yeah, big areas. I think there's 735,000 hectares of mangroves in Kalimantan they're talking about. Is there a pointer on this thing? Nope. What did I do? Okay, there. And so this is in, sorry, this is all in Indonesian and it's very small anyway. I told you I haven't presented in ages. But this is in the forestry estate and this is out of the forestry estate. So about 400,000 hectares in the forestry estate and 350,000 outside with very little regulation. And it turns out neither of that matters. This is one of 2 landscapes I work in the island of Sulawesi in Gorontalo province. This part is a strict nature reserve, and this part is an integrated forest management area. It was about 8,000 some hectares of mangroves in this whole landscape in 2000, reduced by 5,000 hectares over the last 15 years due to aquaculture development in a strict nature reserve. So very illegal, undertaken by willing transmigrants who are, who come from South Sulawesi and also in this forest management unit. This is what it looks like on the ground. That's my team. I run an NGO in Indonesia and also work for the university here. Here we're doing some surveys, and this is to make a pond. You basically create a ditch. It's called a ring ditch. Put the spoils up on a dike wall, and then this will be impounded by water for a while. There's a weir door somewhere here, and they'll drown these mangroves and kill them real quick. You can see this was like just a couple months earlier. This had been ring ditched, and then they only raise shrimp and milkfish in this little ditch. Very little takes place in this central plateau. Very inefficient land use, low value, but mangroves are underprotected kind of commons areas in most places and vulnerable to conversion. Indonesia's lost maybe 600,000 to 1 million hectares of mangroves due to that kind of conversion in the past decades. But it started a long time ago. My other landscape I work in is Demak, North Central Java. And this map we dug up in Leiden in the Netherlands. And it's from the late 1800s, showing aquaculture already quite dominant in the landscape in the late 1800s, right? These are a time series from 1972 to present day. Mangroves are pink in this one, and there's barely any in 1972 and almost none at all right now. This is about a 13,000 hectare landscape with only less than 1,000 hectares of mangroves. And a big problem, I think it's in the next slide, with coastal subsidence and erosion. They've lost all their mangrove cover. I won't go into all the details of why that causes a landscape to erode and subside, but we can talk about that later if needed elsewhere. Erosion and subsidence is severe here. 5.25 kilometers of coastal ingress over maybe a 10+ year period, and about 2,000 hectares of that area is now submerged below mean sea level, and mangroves can't colonize intertidal areas below mean sea level by and large. Now, here's where I'm going to trip over myself a lot, so bear with me, although I have no time to really trip. I'm trying to present this in sort of a resilience thinking kind of model. These are some generic resilience curves that I adapted from Brian Walker at CSIRO, CSIRO, how do you say it? Just kind of you can imagine a mangrove system being pristine up here, and then at some point, a slow moving variable kind of brings it across this threshold, pushes it across the threshold, and the value on the y-axis here of goods and services from the mangrove falls drastically. And this one's just a similar curve. This is a step function more or less. And I've looked at like a slow moving biophysical variable and a slow moving, maybe like surface elevation, and a slow moving social variable, maybe like community or individual memory of the value of mangroves for their livelihoods. And if aquaculture is developing a landscape over time, they forget what a mangrove was worth. Here I'm going to depict these systems, the social ecological mangrove system as an oval with some dynamics going on of the different factors and their centripetal dynamics, which means they sort of form around an attractor, and that keeps this regime or this landscape kind of functioning, in this case, in high value, and then a degraded regime over a threshold. Just some symbols I'm going to use throughout this talk. So here's that diagram again, and this time I overlaid different mangrove restoration options or management options. Most of them are restorative. A pristine system can be kind of improved a little, maybe climate proofed. If you tried to make sure there was a buffer in the back in the hinterland so there could be retreat if there was sea level rise. A nearly intact system could be maybe there's a road built with a culvert that's undersized and water doesn't flow in and out of the mangrove well, and you could remove that. So like early preemptive restoration or stress removal. I wrote a paper on that with my mentor, Robin Lewis, if people want to learn about preemptive restoration. Here's a degraded system, and the options are restoration back to the pre-existing system, rehabilitation to the slightly less valuable system, or two more options: intentional transformation. Maybe this is aquaculture area, and maybe this constitutes putting a functional green belt in to protect the aquaculture, or business as usual, unintentional transformation, continued degradation, maybe over another threshold. So I went through that quick enough. That was good. I assessed two landscapes for the restoration opportunity in Indonesia, looking at the biophysical side and also the social side. Some of the measurements we took are like the vegetation in a reference site and on this site, surface elevation, and landscape modifications that prohibit natural secondary succession. So here we're shooting elevations of substrate in Gorontalo, which is not too disturbed. And then here's Demak, and they've converted nearly the entire landscape, and this is kind of evidence of the erosion and subsidence, right? So we like mangroves, but they shouldn't be growing in your house. And this is just, we're all covered with fluid mud because it's really a fluid, muddy system there. Here's some of the data. In Gorontalo in Tanjung Panjang, only about 3 centimeters of under mean sea level of average surface elevation. Mangroves kind of start growing at mean sea level up to high tide. Here, the landscape subsided so that the average pond surface elevation was about 33 centimeters below mean sea level. So you would need to, for mangroves to grow there again, you would need to put at least 33 centimeters of fill material in there to get them to grow again. The vegetation in Tanjung Panjang is orange. Species and community associations reduce slightly over time. In Demak, much more drastic loss of mangrove species. And community associations, meaning you also lose their like functional role of colonizing exposed sediments. And landscape modifications in Tanjung Panjang, just about 3 major ones that prohibit natural secondary succession of mangroves. Here in Demak, heaps of landscape modifications. And so, okay, breathe. I also looked at, like looking at the biophysical opportunity to restore these areas. I also looked at practitioner capacity to overcome like barriers or capitalize on like enabling factors. And people self-assess them. How good are they at mangrove restoration? And they said they were largely good, green or yellow. No one said they were bad at this, right? And we ended up calculating that 100% of that Sulawesi landscape is restorable with techniques we know. And about 81% of the Demak landscape is restorable, except for that district that has totally eroded and subsided. So here I start to empiricize that. It's not a model. I don't know what it is. This figure, and just putting in some numbers, right? So we know how many species and community associations we had in Tanjung Panjang and Demak before and after deforestation or degradation. And somewhere in between is the threshold. So the Demak, the Javanese landscape, crossed a threshold. It's lost too much vegetation. It's lost some functional roles. It can't colonize certain surfaces. Same with surface elevation. Maybe 4 centimeters below mean sea level is not too degraded, but there's a threshold somewhere, which we still have to figure out, take more data on and understand thresholds for each landscape or for Indonesia. And 33 centimeters below mean sea level is way too low. And mangroves won't grow there unless you do some extreme activities. I keep using this this kind of threshold and system state model to explain what's going on in Demak in the Javanese landscape. And this, based on the landscape modifications, has crossed over the decades multiple cascading thresholds. We have 4 thresholds here and 5 regimes or system states, going from pure mangroves all the way down, like then they're converted, like Kath had been talking about earlier, to mangroves and aquaculture and rice, to green belts and aquaculture and rice, aquaculture only, and then finally at some point it's just a mudflat below mean sea level and cannot be vegetated, maybe except with seagrass. All right, also some social studies to look at the other side of this picture. Looking a lot at interviewing stakeholders, fish farmers. These are transmigrant fish farmers who came from South Sulawesi and moved to North Sulawesi. What are their attitudes toward mangroves, towards restoration? Is there conflict? Are there tenurial issues? Kath and I wrote a little brief on tenurial issues in mangroves, which I refer to later again. I won't talk about economics right now. I won't have time. A little bit on policy and governance as well. Here's a historical timeline of management events that have taken place in Tanjung Panjang since the 1980s. Those interviews with the fish farmers, I ran qualitative content analysis with some social science and came up with these major themes, which kind of progress over time. And I'm not going to talk about them today. I talk about them in other talks, but these categories which we identified, like big issues, conflict, tenure, lack of access to future benefits from restoration and things like that emerged. And they, I've adopted 2 minutes as barriers to restoration. So these are social barriers, and there's 15 in Tanjung Panjang and 16 in Demak, social barriers. But this landscape specific, why won't stakeholders engage in restoration? And I'll keep going. We did some restoration opportunity mapping in multi-stakeholder groups in both landscapes with government, private sector, lots of communities, and they mapped out where they thought restoration could take place, developed in Tanjung Panjang these scenarios, a very conservative scenario, a moderate one, and a full restoration scenario, representing about 2.5% only of the degraded habitat or landscape, up to half. I can't go into too much detail, I know, on this right now. In Java, much less restoration opportunity, only 0.4% of the 13,000 hectare former mangrove area. So only 50 hectares people were willing to restore. Very, very, very low. Biophysical opportunity was 80% of the landscape. When you add the social layer, you're down to 0.4%. So there's very significant bottlenecks and barriers when you look at human factors. And I've tried to plot these. All the human factors contributing to the initial landscape degradation on the left of this threshold, plus the environmental factors that contributed to degradation. On the right, these are factors which we can consider a new term, I don't know if I coined it or not, restoration capital. If it's in surplus, that might enable restoration. If these factors are in deficit, restoration is barred, and the landscape may continue to further degrade, right? So just, I want to reiterate that these are very specific sets of factors for these two landscapes. They may be common, they align well to things in the literature, but there's still a lot of investigation that needs to take place. Kath and my papers here that we refer to our little note, and land tenure definitely came up on both sides of this threshold as a key issue, but there's many more. So there's heaps of human factors prohibiting restoration. I'm done. A couple more slides. I'll cruise. And people can ask questions outside of here, I guess. Anyway, I just kind of modeled the restoration options for these two landscapes. So Tanjung Panjang is currently like this in Gorontalo. The strict nature reserve needs to be restored by law, but it's got to cross a significant threshold to do that. The other side, the eastern side, could be rehabilitated, maybe mixed land use. In Dumak has crossed multiple thresholds. There's opportunities to rehabilitate some of the area that hasn't subsided and eroded too much, and for the area that has subsided and eroded too much, some kind of intentional transformation is required. Otherwise, it'll continue to degrade over additional thresholds. Now, the last two slides, the last slide too, maybe. Indonesia's target of 600, coming back to that, 600,000 hectares in the next 4 years, 1.82 million hectares by 2045. They're looking for land which is clean and clear, no tenurial issues, no conflict to restore. There's some of that in Indonesia. This is an example. Cleared for aquaculture, no one's managing it, and it's already growing back naturally, and it's been planted. There's an adequate green belt here, but there's not a lot of that. There's not 600,000 hectares of that in Indonesia. There is a lot of this, aquaculture ponds in and out of active management, and that's where people need to focus. How do you resolve, how do you talk stakeholders into wanting to restore that? And what they're doing as a default, if they can't invest and do this, is continue to plant sub-mean sea level mudflats outside of the natural threshold where adult mangroves exist. That's the boundary where mangroves can exist. And they keep planting these mudflats because there's no tenure issues, but there's also no way that mangroves will survive at this inundation level. Last slide, future ways forward. So I'm like consulting for the World Bank on that big project right now, and some of the tools we're developing are like a national scale assessment of where mangroves could be restored, and then it needs to be followed up by some multidisciplinary teams, biophysical and social scientists, economists, et cetera, to identify a restoration opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. That was a really impressive body of work. We have time for one quick question? Yeah.
Louis. We'll hear from a second.
Thanks, Ben. That was interesting. I was just hoping you could expand a little bit on, you mentioned that there were social, cultural factors that led to much of the potential area that could have been rehabilitated, reduced to, from 80% to 0.4% or something like that in the Javanese example. Perhaps you can expand on what some of those social, cultural factors were.
Okay, sure. And I'll try to be brief, but it's a long one, so we could talk later. In Java, they own most of those ponds. They're about 2 hectares average size. In Gorontalo, transmigrants came up and converted an area that was undermanaged, under-enforced, right? And those ponds average about 30 hectares in size. In Java, half the farmers lose money when they undertake aquaculture nowadays. I did an economic chapter on that. And half win, and it goes in and out of production. In Gorontalo, they average about $1,200 per hectare per year of profit, of net profit. So $30,000 more net profit. So opportunity cost is huge in that Sulawesi landscape. They don't want to restore mangroves because they're making a lot of money in aquaculture. In the other areas where aquaculture is not productive, disease comes in, or the landscape subsiding, they can't build a dike wall, et cetera, there's still forms of opportunity costs. Like they own that land, they can trade it, it's got perceived value by some, right? So they're not convinced. Plus they don't have memory of the value of a free-flowing open access mangrove system. And it's, so there's a lot of work to be done on that. How do people really feel the benefit of mangrove forests? And there's 2, I'll close real quick. there's kind of two economic concepts behind that, like a direct use value, a financial value, or an economic value, which includes like ecosystem services. And the direct use value is probably too low. There's not enough things that people recognize to make money out of whole mangroves. And the ecosystem service value can't be realized yet because of policy issues and such, like blue carbon, which is